Good evening, my friends. Today we will immerse ourselves in a quiet, historical prelude to sleep and peace. The quiet music fades, like distant cathedral bells in a thick fog, or the gentle rustle of wind through the leaves in a monastery. There's no war in this story, no clanking of swords or sieges, just silk sleeves clinging to splinters and the slow realization by those above that the ground is no longer solid beneath their feet. Some say history is shaped by kings and the brutality of war, but sometimes it is made by dirt, gravity, the invisible softness beneath great intentions. This is the story of that day, the day elegance fell to the ground, when pride met physics, and when silence returned, closing its heavy door behind the last ripple in the latrine of 1184. So as you settle in, wherever you are, curled up on the couch, wrapped under a blanket, drifting in the stillness of the night, let your breathing slow, let your muscles rest, let the world be still, and let this interesting, slow story transport you to a long past, where the air was thick with incense and river mist, and even the greatest of men could fall not from violence, but from dirt. And when we reach the end of this story, when the last nobleman is dragged from his trench, when the musicians pack their instruments, and the emperor returns to his new campaign, be sure to let us know you were here. Leave a gentle comment below. Tell us where you're listening from. Maybe from a rainy street in Glasgow, a quiet apartment in Washington, or a sunny balcony in Cyprus. Like the nobles of Mainz, we're all gathered here tonight, quietly, together. So if you want more stories told gently, subscribe, like, and share this special moment with someone who needs a gentle story to fall asleep to. The music gently sinks into the silence. The sun rose gently over the city of Erfurt on the morning of July the 26th, 1184. Its rays did not announce themselves boldly, but rather spilled lazily over the red-tiled rooftops and soft limestone walls, warming the dew from the narrow garden paths outside the walled cathedral precinct. Inside the city, the day was already long in preparation. Though this was the high Middle Ages, Erfurt possessed a certain quiet grandeur. Tucked within the land of Thuringia, its wooden homes and merchant stalls nestled beside the slow-moving Gera River. The streets still held a soft mist from the night, curling around the corners of buildings and rising in thin tendrils between the cobbles. At the heart of it all stood the Petersburg Citadel, a monastery, a fortress, and a symbol of royal authority. It was here that the Diet of Erfurt, a great meeting of nobles, would soon take place. And it was here that one unfortunate count would, without knowing, begin the last slow day of his life. Birds chattered gently in the rafters. Somewhere nearby, a stable boy dozed against a wall, a half-gnawed apple slipping from his hand into the straw. The iron bells of the cathedral had not yet rung, but their silence was filled with the low murmurs of servants stoking kitchen fires, the clink of pewter, the brushing of sleeves against stone. In a large timbered room above the cloister, two monks folded linens. Their movements were slow and practiced. One paused and peered out the window. He could see the first horses approaching, lords in tall saddles, banners drooping with the weight of humid air. The monk turned back without a word. The noblemen were always arriving, always wearing velvet that soaked up dust, always bringing tension in the air like a storm just outside the window pane. The room filled again with the soft sounds of folded fabric. And below, the stone latrines of the monastery sat undisturbed beneath the main hall, quietly holding the remnants of ordinary life as they had for decades. Forgotten, undisturbed. By midday, the nobles had gathered. They arrived in quiet procession, their boots leaving clean impressions in the dust. The great hall, built hastily upon the monastery's latrine vaults some years earlier, stood in readiness. A long wooden structure with simple but weighty timbers, it had been erected for just such occasions. Though no one called it beautiful, it was grand in size and served its purpose well. The air inside was heavy with warmth and wool. The walls bore no tapestries, only the raw grain of timber and stone. A row of narrow, arched windows allowed in pale light, but little breeze. The atmosphere was dense with old breath and candle wax. Still the nobles filed in with dignity, settling onto benches that lined the long sides of the room. King Henry VI, son of Frederick Barbarossa, was but a youth of 18. Yet he presided with the weight of his father's crown upon his brow. He sat quietly, surrounded by his retinue. His eyes wandered occasionally to the windows and the shimmer of heat rising from the rooftops beyond. They had gathered to settle a dispute. Two powerful lords, Landgrave Ludwig III of Thuringia and Archbishop Conrad of Mainz, were in disagreement over lands and rights. The matter was of the kind that could not be resolved with parchment and messengers. It required presence, posture, patience. Wood creaked softly beneath their feet as they took their places, one by one. More than 100 nobles in all, a record perhaps for that fragile hall. Below them, down through the slats of the floor and the narrow beams that bridged the pit beneath, the latrine vaults sat still and full. They had not been emptied in years. It was not uncommon. Monastic plumbing was rudimentary, even advanced by the standards of the time. But the building above had not been designed for the strain of such an audience. But no one considered that then. The nobles listened. The king raised his voice in a slow, clear tone. The dispute began. The proceedings continued with a measured pace. Voices were raised, not in anger, but in formality. The words were long, the phrases drawn from centuries of legal habit. Latin murmured like a prayer, and German dialects folded over one another like layers of cloth. Many in the room began to shift in their seats. The wooden benches had no cushions. The air, though still, was stifling. Dust floated lazily in the shafts of light. Below the floor, the structure groaned softly. A beam, long and wide, bore the greatest weight. It had done so faithfully for many years. But now, burdened by the gathered mass of so many nobles, retainers, pages, and clerks, it had begun to bow. The change was imperceptible. The floor did not tremble. A rat hidden in the shadows below scurried away from the echo of voices above. Its whiskers twitched, and it disappeared behind a pile of damp hay and stone. Back in the hall, a steward brought pitchers of watered wine. It sloshed softly into pewter cups. A few nobles drank, but most held their cups without touching them. One count, his name lost to time, leaned slightly forward to whisper a comment to the man beside him. The other responded with a thin smile and the briefest nod. The floor dipped, slightly, just enough that a small nail, once hammered firmly into a joint, slipped free and fell into the darkness below. There was no sound but a drop into wetness. No one heard it. No one saw. And above, the king raised a hand to silence the room. It happened slowly. So slowly, in fact, that even those nearest the first crack did not understand what was happening. A sound emerged, not a loud snap, but more a sigh of bending timber. as though the building itself had grown weary. Then came the brittle whine of stressed joints, the groaning collapse of aged wood, and the faint, sudden whoosh of air displaced. The center of the hall gave way. Like soft bread beneath a too heavy hand, the floor caved in. Planks fell like dominoes. Benches tipped. The table near the center snapped in two and fell, its contents tumbling into darkness. Some nobles fell silently. Others shouted, but only briefly. Then they too disappeared. They fell not into flames, nor into stone, but into a long, forgotten chamber beneath the floor. A chamber filled with decades of waste. Human waste. A fetid sea held in shadow, pressed beneath the weight of time. The stench rushed upward through the hole, foul and sudden. Some of those near the edge recoiled, stumbling back as the floor splintered beneath their feet. One man caught himself on a remaining beam. Another slipped entirely and vanished into the pit with a splash. It was not chaos. Not yet. It was confusion wrapped in silence. The king, seated safely near the far wall, stood slowly, not yet aware of what had occurred. His men closed around him, ushering him backward. Dust swirled. The sounds of retching and muffled cries filled the room. Nobles at the far edge began to flee. Others leaned over the jagged hole, calling down into the gloom. The sun still shone outside. The birds still chirped. A breeze passed through the high window and lifted the corner of a cloth left on the table. And down below, in the darkness of the pit, the nobles floundered in silence. Their fine robes soaked, their cries muffled, their fates sealed not by sword or politics, but by the slow rot of forgotten waste. Down in the darkness, time slowed. The pit was not deep, perhaps 10 feet to the surface of the waste, but it was vast and uneven. Some who fell landed upon broken planks or stone ledges. Others struck the surface of the refuse and sank deeper, drawn down by layers of wet, clotted matter that had collected over decades. It was not just excrement. The vault had become a catch-all for the detritus of daily life. Discarded cloth, bones, rotted vegetables, soot from chimneys, broken tools, the husks of forgotten things. Time had packed it thick and heavy, and now it opened like a hidden grave. A few men managed to cry out. One flailed in panic, his arms slapping against the thick mire. Another moved his mouth to speak, but only bubbles rose. A hand emerged, grasped wildly at the beam overhead, and slipped back under. Silence again. The hall above had emptied in panic. The floor was still unstable. No one dared approach the edge. The hole gaped wide now, uneven, irregular, jagged with splinters and timber teeth. Smoke from fallen torches curled upward, faint and gray. Sunlight slanted through dust. It touched the surface of the pit and revealed what had become of the nobility gathered there that day. A child, one of the young pages, stood at the doorway, staring. His cap had fallen to the floor. No one noticed him. And down below, the flies had begun to stir. In the courtyard, chaos was quiet. Men moved with the slowness of disbelief. Messengers had been dispatched in all directions, some on horseback, others on foot. Monks whispered prayers. A group of servants brought blankets, unsure what else to do. The king remained in a smaller chamber nearby, surrounded by guards. He had not spoken since the collapse. Outside, the summer air still smelled of dust and herbs. But at the edge of the inner yard, near the open cloister gate, the scent of the pit had begun to drift. It came on the breeze in sour waves. No one said it aloud, but all began to understand. One monk had descended partway into the vault using a rope ladder tied to a nearby support. He returned pale and shaking, unable to speak. Another tried to ghost down, but the stench overtook him. He vomited quietly into a pail and did not attempt again. In the shade of a yew tree, a clerk wrote down names, those who had entered the hall and those known to have emerged. The ink dried slowly in the warm air. The list was incomplete. Some names would never be confirmed. Some men had no attendants. Others had traveled without heraldry, hoping to speak on land disputes or titles. They had vanished without even the dignity of memory. And yet, the bells of the monastery did not toll. No one had ordered them to ring. In the early evening, the monastery settled into a strange hush. The monks, always accustomed to silence, now walked more slowly than usual. They carried no candles. They closed the chapel doors with great care. Even the dogs that roamed the garden paths seemed subdued, their tails low, their paws quiet on the earth. In the scriptorium, a single brother continued to copy a manuscript. He dipped his quill with steady rhythm. The Latin on the page was from the Psalms. It spoke of darkness in the pit and deliverance. He paused once, perhaps struck by the words, and looked to the high window. Then he continued writing. In the kitchen, bowls of stew cooled untouched. Bread loaves lay stacked, their crusts hardening. A cook sat on a stool beside the hearth, holding a spoon in his lap and staring into the coals. No one lit the lamps in the cloister. One monk walked the length of the outer corridor, pausing at each window to look out across the city. The rooftops glowed faintly gold in the light of sunset. The river moved gently. Life in Erfurt went on. Merchants called out. Children played in the distance. A dog barked once and then was quiet. But within the citadel walls, the world had shifted. The weight of tragedy did not shout. It sat heavily, like damp wool across the shoulders. No lamentation, no great mourning, just stillness. The kind that presses against the ribs and fills the space between thoughts. That night, they brought lanterns to the hall. Torches were too dangerous, wood and pitch too easily caught. But lanterns, dim and steady, were lowered down near the edge of the vault. One man, a stonemason from the lower quarter, offered to descend. He had worked on the hall years earlier and knew the beams. They tied a rope to his waist and gave him gloves and a cloth soaked in vinegar. He disappeared slowly into the dark. Above, the watchers waited. A priest murmured prayers. The air trembled faintly with the hum of insects. The mason did not find survivors. What he found instead was the slow, sunken ruin of once proud men. Fine fabric soaked in filth, a glint of metal, a clasp, a belt buckle, a chain. A name whispered to those above. He returned twice more, each time paler. By midnight, a dozen names had been confirmed. Some were men of minor status, others of renown. Their titles echoed quietly across the courtyard as the scribe recorded them into the long ledger. A boy brought water in a wooden cup and placed it beside the lanterns. No one drank. By the far gate, a cart waited. It bore sacks of lime and rough blankets. There was talk of sealing the vault, of prayer and closure, of stone lids and quiet remembrance. No decisions were made that night, only lists. And far above, the stars flickered with indifference, cold and white over the city of Erfurt. The next morning dawned with no urgency. The sun rose quietly over the garden behind the monastery. Bees moved from lavender to rosemary without hurry. A small pear tree leaned slightly from the weight of its fruit, which had not yet ripened. The apothecary's bench, worn smooth by time and sun, sat in its usual place by the wall, undisturbed. A single monk tended to the herbs in silence. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, and his hands were stained faintly green from balm and mint. He moved with the slow rhythm of habit, trimming dried blossoms, turning soil, pressing a thumb gently against the tender stalk of rue. Somewhere within the cloister, the bells rang softly, just once, to mark the hour after dawn. Beyond the garden walls, life in the city resumed. The smell of bread drifted from ovens. Water carriers shouted faintly in the street. A blacksmith began work on a wheel rim, the strikes of his hammer muffled by distance. But within the monastery, everything was slower now. The hall remained sealed. Boards had been placed over the broken floor. A cloth had been drawn across the door, not as a barrier, but as a gesture. A few men gathered at the edges of the courtyard. They spoke little. One leaned against the stone trough, arms folded, gaze distant. Inside the herbarium, the monk paused and looked toward the distant roof of the hall. He made no sound, only traced the sign of the cross gently over his chest and returned to the time. By mid-morning, the clerks had resumed their work. A long table had been moved into a chamber beside the chapel. There, two scribes sat in silence, surrounded by stacks of parchment and sealed scrolls. They copied letters of condolence, records of names, and notifications for lords across the empire. The scratch of quills filled the room. A steward read the names aloud from a list written the previous evening. Each was copied onto vellum in careful hand. The titles rendered in formal Latin, the fates softened in phrasing. Perished in the collapse, the letters said. Lost to the accident. Nowhere were the words drowned or filth written. On one of the scrolls, a margin note in smaller script read simply, "Fate uncertain." A young page delivered wax for seals. He placed them one by one on the table and stepped back. No one spoke to him. The boy waited a moment, then left without a word. In the corner, a man with gray hair sorted rings and clasps, retrieved from the pit. They were rinsed and wrapped in cloth. Some bore family crests, others were plain. One had no markings at all, and he set it aside. By the window, a candle flickered. Its flame bent softly in the breeze. Outside, a lone rider galloped east, bearing the first of the letters toward Mainz. His cloak lifted in the wind as the gate closed slowly behind him. Not all who had fled the hall the day before had stayed away. By evening, a few returned, reluctant, hushed, and uncertain. These were men of middle rank, attendants, scribes, younger nobles with less to lose. They came not for duty, but for answers, or perhaps for silence. They stood near the sealed hall and looked toward the boarded floor, where the wood had been hastily covered. A thin rope barred the threshold, but no guard stood watch. There was nothing left to guard. One man stepped forward and removed his cap. His hair was the color of wet straw, and his cloak still bore the faint smell of smoke. He looked not at the boards, but at the wall behind them, stone and quiet, empty of memory. A clerk approached and spoke softly. The two men exchanged words, nodding, neither gesturing. Then the clerk produced a list. The nobleman scanned the names, paused at one, and placed his hand over the ink. His lips moved faintly. Then he turned and walked away. Later that night, a monk placed a single lantern before the door. Its glow was small and steady. No one claimed it. No one moved it. Its light flickered against the wooden cloth, casting a faint amber shimmer across the ground. Like the shimmer of a memory one cannot fully place. 3 days after the collapse, the decision was made. They would not retrieve the rest. A master mason was summoned from the city's edge. He came with stone, lime, and quiet men accustomed to final work. Together, they braced the walls of the hall and laid the first layers of mortar. The pit would be sealed beneath a new foundation, thick, cold, final. They worked in silence. At midday, the abbot stood nearby, reading softly from the book of Psalms. No congregation surrounded him. Only a few monks stood with heads bowed, the words carried only faintly over the stone. By nightfall, the vault was no longer visible. A flat stone floor covered what remained, plain and pale. There would be no marker, no altar, only a record in the annals of the citadel. In a narrow book kept near the vestry, a page was added. The hand that wrote it was steady. In the year of our Lord, 1184, on the feast of St. Anne, the hall did give way under great weight, and many lords were lost. Their remains could not be removed. They rest now beneath the stones, remembered in prayer. And nothing more. The sky above Erfurt turned violet as the sun withdrew. Shadows stretched along the monastery walls. The last sounds of the day softened. The closing of shutters, the lowing of cattle in distant fields, the fading calls of boys at play. A single candle burned in the high window of the scriptorium. Its flame shimmered like a star falling close to earth. The monks retired to their cells. The courtyard emptied. The river Gera moved as it always had, quietly, without concern. And somewhere beneath the citadel, beneath stone and timber, beneath soil and lime, the remains of men and ambition settled into darkness, joined forever, not by war or glory, but by gravity and the quiet indifference of wood and waste. And in the stillness, the city of Erfurt slept.